6 centuries ago, European civilization stood at the threshold of a new era. Yet at this time, most people still knew very little of the world beyond their own small communities, no matter whether they lived in Europe, in Asia, or in Africa. In fact, in the 1400s, most people still thought the world was flat, and understanding of geography was so poor that the best map of the world was over 1,000 years old, having been made not long after the time of Christ. But by the end of the 1400s, as new ideas took hold, knowledge of the world and its people improved rapidly as more and more ships set out from European ports to explore unknown regions of the earth during the great age of exploration. Now let us discover why and how this incredible period of history came to be. At the start of the 15th century, European civilization was still largely feudal, based on self-sufficient manners worked by landless serfs who labored in exchange for a share of the crops they raised and the protection offered by their landowning lords. During medieval times, people lived mostly in small communities, for there were few large cities and very little trade. However, the Black Death, a huge outbreak of bubonic plague which occurred during the 1300s, had wiped out 25% of the European population, and the resulting labor shortage helped hasten the decline of feudalism and bring about the rise of a brand new era called the Renaissance. The word Renaissance means rebirth, and that is just what it was, a time when people began to throw off their old medieval ways, adopting new forms of architecture and art, as well as new ways of living, based on a rediscovery of the civilizations of ancient Rome and Greece. While the medieval period had been marked by an inward, spiritual focus, the leaders of the Renaissance began to search outward for their inspiration. And as a result, there was a burst of interest in geography, astronomy, anatomy, trade, and inventing. One of the greatest Renaissance inventions was a printing press that used movable type, which allowed books to be made cheaply and in large numbers, which in turn allowed ideas and information to spread much more rapidly than in the past. And during the Renaissance, all of these things, the growth of trade, the increased desire to learn more about the earth, new inventions, and a more rapid flow of information, combined to bring about the great age of exploration. It should come as no surprise that it was the idea of getting richer that originally got the Europeans interested in world exploration. Richer by trading in Asian luxury items such as silks, spices, jewels, and porcelains. But in the 15th century, there was an obstacle to that trade. The fact that it was completely controlled by hostile Muslim nations who ruled key lands between Christian Europe and the great trading centers of the Far East. The trade in Asian goods had long followed very definite routes. Goods were transported from the Far East, either by Muslim caravans thousands of miles overland to Mediterranean ports, or in small Muslim ships from India that sailed across the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea. From Red Sea ports, Asian goods usually were carried across the desert to the Nile River, where they went by ship down the river to the Mediterranean Sea. Once the goods reached the Mediterranean ports, the Muslim traders would sell them only to merchants from the Italian city-states of Genoa and Venice. Of the two, Venice was the most powerful, for not only did it have the greatest marketplace in the Western world, It also had special trading privileges in 5 important Muslim cities. Other European nations had never been successful in changing the strict trading arrangements between the Italians and the Muslims. So, in the early 1400s, Spain and Portugal started to look for ways of bypassing the Muslim territories so they could trade directly with Asia. But it was clear that to do this, new sea routes to the east would have to be found. However, at that time, this was a very extreme notion because Portuguese and Spanish ships had never ventured more than 800 miles from their shores. And they realized that if they were to find a new sea route to Asia, they would have to learn a lot more about navigation, the method by which sailors learn the positions of their ships at sea, or they could get hopelessly lost. And yet, they were completely unfamiliar with astronomy and mathematics, the 2 crucial sciences upon which navigation depends. In fact, Europeans of the 15th century knew less about science and geography than did the ancient Romans 1,300 years before. To overcome these problems, this man, a Portuguese prince named Henry the Navigator, founded a school of navigation here at Sagres, near the rocky windswept tip of the European continent, where he even built this house for himself in a place near the school where he could study the sea and watch ships passing by. Prince Henry gathered together experts to teach Portuguese sea captains new methods of seafaring based on science. Here at his navigation school, these experts developed techniques that allowed sailors to stay on course by calculating the positions of their ships relative to heavenly bodies by using newly invented instruments called the astrolabe and the quadrant. And Henry's long-range goal of reaching Asia was made a lot easier because new types of ships, called caravels, had been recently invented, ships that had better rudders for steering as well as improved sails. The ship seen here looks a lot like an early Portuguese caravel. It is a copy of the Mayflower, the English ship that carried the Pilgrims to Massachusetts. And even though the Mayflower was built 150 years after Prince Henry's death, it still had quite a bit in common with the first caravels. For just like the Mayflower, the earliest caravels sat high in the water, were light and fast, but were still wide enough to be able to carry the large amounts of water and food needed for the long months at sea. Here in Lagos, Portugal, not far from the navigation school, Prince Henry founded shipyards to build new caravels. And since much of the money for these ships came from an ancient organization of crusaders called the Knights of Christ, of which Prince Henry was the leader, the sails of the ships usually carried the emblem of the cross seen here. With these new ships, and the well-trained seamen coming from his school, Prince Henry began a systematic campaign of exploration down the coast of Africa. Although his main motive for these explorations was to find a new trade route to Asia, he also had a few more immediate goals. First, he hoped to chart unknown regions of the world and to bring back detailed information which could be analyzed at his school. Second, he hoped to claim land and establish valuable new trading contacts that would increase the wealth and power of his country. And third, he hoped to bring the Christian religion to people in these new lands. And so he even had daily religious services held in this church at the navigation school. The Portuguese explorations of the west coast of Africa continued throughout the lifetime of Henry the Navigator. And as they moved down the coast, the explorers put up carved stone markers, like this one, showing that Portugal claimed these lands by right of discovery. But it took until 1487, almost 3 decades after Prince Henry was laid in his tomb, before the first Europeans, sailing under the command of Captain Bartholomew Dias of Portugal, finally reached the tip of Africa. And another decade passed before the newly discovered route around the Cape of Good Hope was used by Vasco da Gama to reach India, where he established Portugal's first great Asian colony. One of the most unfortunate consequences of the early Portuguese explorations was the rebirth of the slave trade, a trade whose headquarters were located not far from the navigation school. And over the next few centuries, the business of buying and selling human beings became one of the main sources of Portugal's wealth. In the 1480s, over 10 years before the Portuguese reached India, this man, an Italian named Christopher Columbus, had the idea that Asia could be reached not by heading east around the tip of Africa, but by sailing west all the way around the world. In an era when most people thought the earth was flat, this seemed like a ridiculous idea. But Columbus, an educated and experienced seaman, had used the best available information to calculate that only 4,000 miles of ocean lay between Asia and the west coast of Africa. And it was while living at this monastery in Spain that Columbus was able to convince the Spanish rulers, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, to support his bold scheme. But their decision to provide support was made in part because the rulers were feeling extremely good and quite a bit richer, because they had just captured the Moorish kingdom of Granada and its great fortress called the Alhambra, seen here, which was the last Muslim stronghold on Spanish soil. And by the summer of 1492, here in the muddy waters of the Rio Tinto harbor, 3 ships, the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria, awaited his command. And at dawn on the 3rd of August, Columbus's ship sailed out of this harbor on what was to become the most famous voyage in history. Columbus's voyage did not go smoothly at first, for along the coast of Africa, rough seas twice caused damage to one of the ships, and the sailors had to wait a whole month in the Canary Islands while repairs were made. But on September 6th, Columbus's ships finally sailed west into the unknown waters of the Atlantic Ocean. The ships sailed on for over a month, but as time went by, the crew, having seen nothing but water for so long, began to doubt they would ever see land again. Some feared sea monsters would get them, while others worried that if the world was flat, they might sail off its edge. And after 34 days at sea, they begged Columbus to turn back, but he refused. The difficult decision to keep going had enormous historical consequences. For just 2 days later, on October 12th, land was sighted, and Columbus was overjoyed, for he believed he had actually reached Asia. Little did he know that his long journey from Spain had only carried him to the Bahama Islands southeast of present-day Florida. But not long after claiming the island he had discovered for Spain, Columbus sailed off to do some more exploring. He even sent small boats up some of the rivers, searching for the great cities he had heard of. But except for a few native villages, all he found was wilderness. Many years were to pass before the Spanish were to learn that great civilizations existed in this part of the world. In fact, in modern-day Guatemala, This temple still stands in the ancient Mayan city of Tikal, which was abandoned hundreds of years before Columbus was even born. Before returning to Europe in January of 1493, Columbus collected specimens of animal life, exotic plants, and even a few native people to show the king and queen. And on one of the larger islands, he left 40 crewmen behind to establish a Spanish colony. It was April before Columbus laid eyes on the familiar landscape of Spain again. And when he finally reached the royal court, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were so pleased with what they learned, they decided to set him up with a fleet of 17 ships filled with supplies, horses, farm animals, and 1,500 settlers for his new colony. But when Columbus got back to his colony, he discovered that everyone he left behind had been killed by the island people in revenge for the cruel treatment they had received at the hands of these first Spanish colonists. However, Columbus soon started a new colony, and then for 3 years continued his explorations around the Caribbean Sea. And it is interesting to note that even though Columbus returned to the West Indies 2 more times, when he died in 1506, he always believed that he had been exploring Asia. Like Columbus, nearly all the rest of the early European navigators who crossed the Atlantic thought they were exploring the coastline of Asia. An exception was this man, Amerigo Vespucci, a merchant born here in the great Italian city of Florence, who, beginning in 1499, carried out explorations along the coast to the south of the Caribbean Sea. As a result, he came to believe that the shoreline he was seeing did not belong to Asia, but was part of a previously unknown continent, which he called the New World. And when he got back to Europe, Vespucci took advantage of the new printing presses to publish his ideas. And it was thanks to this invention that his ideas spread rapidly across Europe. In fact, Amerigo Vespucci became so well known that many people of that era believed he had been the first European to make discoveries across the Atlantic. This was why, when a German map maker created a new map of the world in 1507, he named the southern continent America in his honor. As it turns out, the first Europeans to reach the New World were the Vikings who, around the year 1000, explored and even temporarily settled along what is today the east coast of Canada. But during the Great Age of Exploration, the first Europeans to reach that part of the world were John Cabot and his son Sebastian, who in 1497 sailed from England and returned the next year, sailing down the North American coast as far as the Chesapeake Bay. By 1519, there were still some people who thought Asia could be reached more quickly by sailing west from Europe. And to them, the continents of the New World were often viewed as little more than obstacles in their path. One such man was Ferdinand Magellan, who on September 20th, 1519, sailed out of the Spanish harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, seen here, with a fleet of 5 ships and 241 men. And a year later, after many struggles, Magellan discovered a passage around the tip of South America, today called the Straits of Magellan. The voyage through this passage was extremely difficult and took 5 weeks, but finally they reached the calmer waters of a vast ocean that Magellan named the Pacific, which means peaceful. Then, for over 3 months, they saw nothing but the endless sea. The men on the ships grew weak because all they had to eat were leather hides, wormy biscuits, and whatever rats they could catch. So with each day, their fear and misery increased. But after sailing thousands of miles west from Cape Horn, Magellan's ships reached an island where they could take on fresh water and food. This amazing first voyage around the world continued for another year, but finally ended in 1522 when a single ship returned to the harbor at San Lucar after an absence of nearly 3 years. But that ship carried only 17 men, because the other 224 original crew members, as well as Magellan himself, had died along the way. But the sailors who survived made history, for they had shown that Asia could be reached by sailing west from Europe. But much more importantly, their voyage proved conclusively that the world is round. In 1519, the same year that Magellan left for Asia, this man, Hernando Cortés, sailed from Spain with a fleet of 11 ships and 600 men, hoping to conquer Mexico. At that time, most of Mexico was ruled by Montezuma II, the emperor of the Aztec tribe, whose magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan was built where modern-day Mexico City now stands. This part of Mexico was the center of Mexican civilization. In fact, hundreds of years before the Aztecs, an ancient tribe called the Teotihuacans built the enormous temple seen here. When Cortés arrived in Mexico, the Aztecs, who were probably the most advanced civilization in the New World, at first welcomed him, thinking he was a messenger from one of their gods. But Cortés wanted conquest, and there was little the Aztecs could do to stop him. For the Spaniards possessed deadly cannons and guns, and the Aztecs did not. They also possessed metal armor to protect themselves from spears and arrows, and the Aztecs did not. And the Spaniards had horses to carry men and supplies, and the Aztecs did not. So with advantages like these, and with the help of other tribes who hated the Aztecs, it took only a few years for Cortés to bring Spanish rule to Mexico. And just 10 years later, in 1531, a similar scene was played out in Peru when the forces of Francisco Pizarro destroyed the magnificent Inca Empire. After Peru and Mexico fell to Spain, men such as Coronado and De Soto set off to explore lands that are today part of the southern United States, lands which they claimed for Spain. And by the mid-16th century, most of the newly discovered parts of the world had been colonized by Spain and Portugal, according to the terms of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Under this treaty, worked out in 1494, the Pope awarded all the newly discovered lands to the west of a certain line to Spain, while all those to the east went to Portugal. But these arbitrary restrictions did not sit well with other European nations, and starting in the late 16th century, they began to found their own colonies. And as these global empires expanded, world exploration grew at a rapid pace. Most European nations grew richer because of the things their colonies produced, such as gold, silver, furs, sugar, or cotton. But things changed even more in the places where the colonies were established. For as European customs were introduced, native customs and languages began to disappear. Here in Mexico, for example, temples where tens of thousands of human sacrifices had been performed each year were torn down and replaced by churches. Missionaries arrived in large numbers, and native people became Christians. European tools and inventions were brought to the colonies. And as more and more settlers arrived from Europe, the native people were sometimes enslaved. But the greatest change was the destruction of up to 80% of the Native American population from diseases accidentally carried to the New World by the Europeans. The great age of exploration that began so quietly in Portugal during the early 1400s brought many changes. Colonization caused a huge population shift from one side of the Atlantic Ocean to the other. And while the Europeans came willingly and quite often got richer, the Africans were forced to come and usually lived as slaves in extreme poverty. But in spite of its tragedies, the great age of exploration succeeded in increasing our knowledge of geography. And communication developed between peoples of the world that previously had not even known of one another's existence. And as more and more ships crossed the great oceans, the different races, cultures, and religions of the world eventually began to share ideas and learn from one another. And in this way, the foundation was laid down for the modern, interdependent world in which we live today. Trade with the Far East in the 15th century was controlled by Muslim traders who would sell their Asian spices, silks, jewels, and porcelains only to European traders from the city-states of and the Great Age of Exploration began at a time when Europe was leaving the medieval era and entering the historical period of cultural rebirth called the country of developed an important school of navigation in the 1400s. The explorer named was the first European to reach India by sailing around the tip of Africa. The development of new ships called helped make world exploration possible in the 1400s. Three important goals of the early explorers were to and Columbus believed that the lands of lay only about 4,000 miles to the west of the western coast of Africa. The first Spanish colony in the New World was established by the continents of the New World are named after a merchant explorer named in the 16th century, a man named led the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, while a man named led the Spanish conquest of the Incas.